In a recent podcast, Dr. Mike Israetel discussed the detrimental mental health effects that anabolic steroid use has had on his mind. And so, in this video, I will be exploring the science on why anabolic steroids may sometimes lead to psychological issues and even psychiatric issues. And so, anabolic steroids are essentially synthetic derivatives of the male hormone testosterone. We also have other forms of performance-enhancing strategies, such as the use of human growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor. And each of these has different effects on the body, and their side effect profile is also different. In the case of anabolic steroids, you might have heard that, especially at higher doses, the use of anabolic steroids is associated with higher cardiovascular risk, higher liver toxicity. There's also, of course, testosterone suppression, which is especially problematic when the usage of these anabolic steroids is done at a younger age. And then in the case of the other performance-enhancing strategies, which include hormone augmentation through the use of human growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, there's the risk of an increased risk in diabetes and also metabolic syndrome. So when we are looking specifically at the usage of anabolic steroids, most people aren't necessarily aware of what psychological impacts may come from the usage of these steroids, or even why these effects happen. And so when we are looking at anabolic steroids, we normally hear the term roid rage. So people know that the usage of anabolic steroids, especially at higher doses, may increase levels of aggression. But in actuality, there are also a large number of other effects that can happen. And so anabolic steroids, they easily cross the blood-brain barrier and affect the central nervous system by binding to cytoplasmatic androgen receptors. And certain regions of the brain have a higher density of these androgen receptors. So when we are thinking about these brain regions, we're seeing higher densities of these androgen receptors in the amygdala, the hippocampus, brainstem, and the hypothalamus. And so all of these regions have very important roles in terms of cognition and emotion. And so it makes sense that if we are somewhat modulating and altering the normal functioning patterns of these brain regions, it is normal that we're going to have some sort of mental effects. And so there are some brain imaging studies that have seen that through those who use anabolic steroids, especially long-term usage, results in altered connectivities between these limbic brain regions. Although I need to point out that these functional connectivity brain imaging studies are often hard to decode because there are so many other variables that must be controlled to fully understand whether that altered functional connectivity is actually what is behind the changes in behavior. What we do know from other studies is that supraphysiological doses of these anabolic steroids may cause apoptotic effects on neurons. So we may actually have neurotoxic effects through the use of these anabolic steroids. And this, of course, then results in accelerated brain aging. It also results in a greater vulnerability to neurodegenerative processes. And so this is a big problem. And it is also not fully understood whether we can reverse these aging effects that are caused by sustained anabolic use. So meaning that if we have someone who has been taking anabolic steroids for a long time, and even if that person stops, we're still not sure if we can reverse some of these effects on the human brain. In terms of clear-cut psychiatric and cognitive impacts that we can observe from anabolic steroid use, we have, for example, on the short term, transient euphoria or hypomania. Hypomania is essentially a high energy state where the person feels very well, but is still rather functional. This is often seen, for example, in type 2 bipolar disorder, where you have these increased energy states that do not reach the stage of full-blown mania. But then on the long term, the use of these anabolic steroids, they often cause anxiety, impulsivity, irritability, aggression, and even cognitive impairments. And these cognitive impairments are seen in terms of memory and visual spatial abilities. In terms of memory, we have also seen that sustained anabolic steroid use may cause an atrophy of the hippocampus, while on the inverse side, it might actually increase the size of the amygdala, which is one of the fear centers of the brain, although the amygdala has many other functions. But we have seen that a prolonged anabolic steroid use may actually lead to neurogenesis of the amygdala. Anabolic steroid use may also lead to dependence, so we can actually very quickly see people becoming addicted to the use of steroids. And so various factors go on here. So with the use of anabolic steroids, it's very easy for the person to develop a body image obsession. And so many times the initiation and the continuation of anabolic steroids is generated by some level of body image distortion or even obsession. We also have dysregulation of neuroendocrine factors. We have, like I said before, the suppression of natural production of testosterone. We can have increasing levels of fatigue, loss of libido, and depression. We may also have a dysregulation of stress regulation mechanisms, such as the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and this can often lead to cortisol resistance and other issues. And then, of course, we can have a positive feedback loop in which, through these physiological changes, we are actually promoting also the continued use and these psychological changes that, once again, promote the use of these steroids. Before I mention one of the most worrisome effects of the use of anabolic steroids in the brain, and this is through neurotoxicity. And so there are some ways in which, some pathways in which this neurotoxicity is promoted. So one of them is through an increase in oxidative stress, so through the increased production of reactive oxygen species. And normally this is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction, which is also associated with the prolonged use of anabolic steroids. And as we know, mitochondrial dysfunction is a big problem, because through the impaired energy production and disrupted calcium homeostasis, we can actually have a bunch of problems where we might have the overactivation of some brain regions and the underactivation of other brain regions. And so this disruption in the ability of the brain to balance its own activity may lead to psychiatric issues. And this is an underlying theory in the brain energy thesis that has been put forward by Dr. Christopher Palmer. And then we also have other changes in terms of neurotransmitter alteration. So we can have dysregulated dopamine and serotonin levels. And as we know, dysregulated dopamine is directly linked to a huge number of psychiatric conditions, if not all psychiatric conditions, since dopamine is such an important neurotransmitter. Also, some studies point to alterations in neuroplasticity. As I mentioned, one of them is these changes in the functional cognitivity between these brain regions. We also have studies that point to decreases in gray matter, although we have some regions which we can actually see some form of neurogenesis, such as the amygdala. And there are also some studies which observe a decrease in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is also an important part of overall neurogenesis and plasticity mechanisms. A short reflection which I would like to offer in this video in terms of why the increase in testosterone might lead to aggressive behavior, and maybe why that isn't necessarily the case, I think is an interesting point. And so Robert Sapolsky often mentions this, and he talks about how testosterone is not necessarily increasing aggression levels, it's actually increasing the individual's motivation to achieve and maintain a social status. And so through the pursuit of achieving social status, of achieving a place on the hierarchy, that might create or exacerbate aggressive tendencies. So what this means is that the primary drive is the pursuit of status, not necessarily aggression. And so to conclude, another effect of the use of anabolic steroids, especially the higher you go in dosage, is the increased probability of developing psychosis. And so psychosis is normally defined as a break from reality, where the person is experiencing delusions, hallucinations, and in the case of the use of anabolic steroids, normally these psychosis is presented in terms of delusions of grandeur. So where the person starts believing that they're extremely special or gifted with certain abilities. But however, in the case of psychosis, which is induced by these anabolic steroids, normally the psychosis clears up after the usage of low doses of antipsychotic medications. One of the case studies mentioned the use of 4 milligrams of risperidone, which is an atypical antipsychotic. So generally, psychosis goes away rather quickly once the person stops using anabolic steroids and does some sort of antipsychotic therapy. And so hopefully you found this video useful. I thought this was an important video to do because I think the use of anabolic steroids, especially amongst a younger population, is increasing. Partially this is due to social media, where you see a lot of people with physiques that are unattainable through natural standards. And so there's this increased pressure of people in order to be perceived in a different way, in order to match these people that they see on social media, to have better physiques. But oftentimes people are not aware of the side effects or the actual risks that come through the use of steroids. And so this is where I really applaud the work of Dr. Mike Israetel, where he's really open about his experience with the usage of these anabolic steroids. And he's also very open in regards to how, if the risks are very high in the usage of a certain tool, such as in this case the use of anabolic steroids to improve your physique, then you better have a really good reason to be using them. Because even under the best circumstances with medical supervision, you're not going to be able to offset all of these risks. You might be able to better manage them as well. You're able to lower the risk profile, but you're never going to be able to fully discard all of these issues that I mentioned. And I think it's also important to talk about the mental effects that come from the use of anabolic steroids, because normally when we think of anabolic steroids, we're just thinking about the physique, we're just thinking about the physical effects. But oftentimes the mental effects, the psychological effects are scarier. And so I just think that this is an important aspect to be mentioned when discussing the use of these substances. So hopefully you found this video useful, and thank you for watching it.